Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee will come to order. As usual, we have a general agenda and a consent agenda. The consent agenda is normally taken first. Items that aren't pulled from the consent agenda will be considered in one motion. As usual, before we do that, I will check to see if folks are here about any of the property items. I will note that item C2A is removed from today's agenda. There's continuing discussion between the parties and staff and our attorney's office, so it's off. That's the 1310 Brookstown Avenue matter. Will not be discussed today. Council Member Montgomery wants C1A, B, C, and D removed for discussion, so I won't bother to read those out. Here are the other properties that remain on the consent agenda. If anyone is here to speak to any of these, please raise your hand when I cite the address. 1118 East 23rd Street, 955 Panola Road. Are y'all here for that one? 955 Panola Road. Okay. What about 958 Panola Road? Are you here on that one as well? All right. 212 North Spring Street.
Dan?
Yes.
That one's the one that's the historic property, isn't it? Spring Street?
I don't know.
Could we pull that?
All right. 206 East 27th Street. 2656 Bluebird Lane. 1852 East 4th Street. 2378 Greenway Avenue. That was a hand up in the back? No? Okay. 2601 Manchester Street. 711 East 16th Street. 405 East 30th Street. Okay, that leaves on the consent agenda items C2, B, and C, everything under C3, C4, and C5. Is there a motion for approval?
Move for approval.
Second.
Is there discussion? Hearing none, those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. That is approved. We will now go to, well, actually the entirety of items C1, A through H are up. And we'll start with item A, please.
Item C1, ordinance ordering the demolition and removal of structure pursuant to Chapter 10, Article 5, Section 10-203F1, Code of the City of Winston-Salem, repairs less than 50% of the value of the structure. A, Legacy Investments, LLC, 2331 Dunbar Street.
Okay, and before we have a staff report, actually, Councilmember Montgomery indicated that you had a comment on items C1, A, B, C, and D. Would you care to?
Yeah, and it's more so about us, again, paying attention to some of the concentration. Is all four of these properties are in the same neighborhood. Dunbar, and then you go down further into Eldora and the backside where these properties are, you have three houses which are side by side. The items B, C, and D, which are in incredibly worse shape than the A is, they all, again, continue to cause issues in the Dreamland Park neighborhood, which happens to be the same neighborhood which I live in. And there's properties and neighborhoods just like this in other areas. And so as we continue to look at these, I pulled them off. I do not object to them. I think that what the staff brings are and support those recommendations. But continue to ask this committee and council and staff to look at ways on how we can further address these in as swift manner as we possibly can. Because although we know we're stuck to a process and a timeline, when individuals wake up every day and they see these properties, that timeline really doesn't mean anything to them. and continuing to help them to understand what we're doing. And I convey that message in our meetings that we have with staff of what we deal with and what we have. But I'm happy to see these properties come forward and look forward to that transition.
All right, Councilmember Montgomery, if you're basically in support of moving forward on these, I would recognize, if there are no other questions, a motion to advance items C1, A, B, C, and D on a single motion.
Keeping Councilmember Montgomery's comments in mind, I move that we approve items C1, A, B, C, and D.
Second.
All right, and there was no one from the audience who indicated they were here to speak on Dunbar Street or Eldora Street. So without further discussion, those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. Items C1A through D are approved. We'll go to, let me check, did someone raise their hand for the property at 1118 East 23rd Street? Did I get a hand up for that? That was my error.
Motion to approve.
Second?
Second.
Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, so that takes care of items C1A through E. We did have hands up on items F and G, so we will take those individually. Item F, 955 Panola Street, and we will begin with the staff report. We'll give you a minute, Mr. Bailiff. I know we've been hopping around here.
Chairman Bessie, members of the committee, C1F is 955 Panola Road. This is property owned by Gerald and Cynthia Hutton, identified by tax block 3425A, lot 39. All the requirements for consideration have been met. The staff recommends that an ordinance to repair or demolish and remove within 90 days be adopted. The estimated cost to repair is $2,150. The fair market value is $90,876.
Mr. Bailiff, is this a currently occupied structure?
No, it's a vacant structure.
Okay. If you'll hold a moment. Now, we do have a sign-up sheet. No one signed up, but you did raise your hand when I asked. So if you will, are you here to speak in opposition to this?
We're here in support of moving forward with
Okay.
demolition or whatever needs to be done to make repairs to this property.
I see. For the record, if you would step to the mic and just note your names, any is fine, and
Yes, I'm Sarah Lee Frederick,
address.
949 Panola Road, Winston-Salem, 27106.
And your comment on this property, 955 Panola Road, and I presume the other two properties there?
This is one of two properties.
One of two, I'm sorry, one of two
Yeah,
properties.
one across the street from this property. This particular property's been abandoned for at least 3 years, the other property for about 15. No repairs have been done. I seem to think, well, it's just an assumption, but there's never been a for sale sign. I got the impression that people walked away from the loan. There was a heavy damage to the roof, to the point that because of the excessive leaking, several of the ceilings in the house have collapsed into the floor, which you can look through a window and see, and I did so with one of the city inspectors, Mr. Green, and there was mold growing all through the house. Someone is paying for the yard to be mowed, but it's mow and go. Half of it's being done at the very back of the property. It is overgrown. A lot of erosion that has continued to erode into my property, and after about 10 years ago, where I actually paid to have someone come in to repair the damage. With about 8 dump truckloads of fill dirt, it has all washed away. But didn't get any response for the people when they were living there. I don't know exactly what's happened. I do know that I was told by someone that Bank of America is the one that may own the property now, because I went to a local branch, spoke to a manager, and she took pictures, they came out and actually paid to cut a tree off my side of the property that had fallen into, It's been a constant problem. The value of my home has gone from $125,000 to $102,000. And I'll be glad to speak or let Sardonis speak about the other property and what knowledge I have of that also.
Well, thank you very much for
Okay.
taking the time to come out and being
Yeah.
involved in the process. Are there any questions? All right, again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there questions or comments from the committee? Yes, Councilman Rapp.
The only comment is, as we've said before, people are just sick and tired of some of these dwellings in their neighborhood. I mean, you go to work or you're retired, you get up, you try to plant some flowers, grass, engage everybody in an association. But meanwhile, you got these property owners who are vacant, come in, do whatever they can just to try to stay off as they say, under the radar. But I support what you're trying to do. I know a lot of people saying, well, we tearing down houses and we leaving blighted property. I'd rather have a green space beside my house than to have a house that nobody lives in and it looks awful. So I support how you feel.
Thank you, ma'am. Councilmember Taylor.
Mr. Bailiff, if you can just give us a little bit more information about the order. As I understand it, if this is approved today, this is a 6-month repair or demolish order. And just talk a little bit about that, what that means.
What the next
3 months, excuse me.
What the next move would be, if approved here, it would go to city council, and by ordinance, there would be a 90-day period following adoption of a demolition ordinance by city council. That 90 days would begin at the point that we have served the property owner with it, and at the end of that 90-day period, we as staff would begin our preparation for demolition of the structure.
So I just wanted you to state that for informational purposes. It's not 3 months from today. It's 3 months from when you're able to properly serve the property owner.
And that's usually within a week or so of adoption by the city council.
Okay?
Okay?
Motion to approve.
Second.
All right. Discussion?
Glad.
Hearing no discussion, those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, that's approved. And let me ask, is there anyone here in opposition to the motion or to the resolution to order that 958 Panola Road property be repaired or demolished? Are you in opposition to that? Okay. All right. Unless there are questions from the committee, is there a motion?
Move for approval.
Second.
All right, if there's no discussion, those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. That's approved as well. Thank you for taking the time to come
Thank
down.
you.
And we have item number C1H, 212 North Spring Street. And again, could I see the hand of
It was me.
oh, yes, I'm sorry, there we go.
And I would ask if Leanne could give us a report about this, because it is a historic property.
All right, if you can hold a moment, Mr. Bailiff, and Leanne Pegram from Historic Resources.
Good afternoon, council members. Thank you. My counterpart, Michelle McCullough, is usually here to speak with you about properties, but I'm here with you tonight. This property at 212 North Spring Street is located within the Holly Avenue National Register Historic District. It is what we call a contributing property, meaning that it dates from the period of significance that the neighborhood was developed and built. In this particular instance, we are not recommending any particular type of delay because of the historic nature of the building What we would like to recommend is perhaps that Preserve Historic Forsyth, which is a local nonprofit preservation group, perhaps work with the property owner to see if there are any solutions. And I think Historic Resources staff would be happy to contact Preserve Historic Forsyth if you would like. If it is to be demolished, we would request that Community and Business Development Department photo document the structure and salvage any significant architectural elements, and I believe that's the usual course that we recommend in such instances.
Thank you. Mr. Bailiff, comments?
No additional comments if you'd like for me to read it into the record.
Please.
The property under consideration is at 212 North Spring Street, identified by tax block 0096, lot 122. It's owned by Jerry Shepherd. Staff, the case meets the requirements for demolition consideration. Staff recommends that an ordinance be adopted ordering the repair or demolish and removal of the structure within 90 days. The estimated cost of repair is $7,746. The fair market value is $39,000.
Mr. Bailiff, would this be a suitable candidate for the NREM process?
The $7,000 estimated cost of repair would probably be a little bit high for that. Usually that is at the cost of the demolition of the structure or less, and the demolition cost would probably, without having any estimates, will be about $5,000 or $6,000.
Questions? From committee? Questions? Comments?
No. I'll move approval.
Is there a second?
Go ahead, please.
Second.
All right, I'll note as a discussion point, Mr. Bailiff, if you could confer with Ms. Pegram about the steps that she was recommending in terms of contacting the Historical Society and seeking an opportunity for documentation if it ends up that there's no party with whom to negotiate.
Yes.
Basically. Thank you. Further discussion? Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's approved. And I'll note it looks like an interesting structure. Hopefully someone will be home, figuratively speaking, to work with you on this.
It would be very nice. Originally, I'm sure it was a very charming house, Dutch colonial revival. It needs some work.
Perhaps the word can circulate that there's a property with real potential here that's been neglected.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the consent agenda. I'll take a moment here, sort of chair's privilege, since this is the proper context, I think, for this note. Of course, it was big news not more than a couple of 3 weeks ago. There was a homicide on 700 Magnolia Street, and the neighbors in that area are well aware, as am I, that that has been considered a problem property in the neighborhood for years. There have been housing, environmental code citations there off and on. There have been police visits to the property off and on. As I have worked to explain to concerned neighbors, the city has done everything we can in the past in that context. And sufficient repairs were made whenever citations were brought up in time to keep it off the legal reach of the demolition list. Since this most recent tragedy, and in light of the entirety of the circumstances for that property, I have asked the city attorney's office to confer with staff both in code enforcement and in the police department to see if there are sufficient grounds to seek to have that property declared a public nuisance and demolished. Those consultations are going on now. I don't have a definite report date, but for those citizens who are concerned by that, with whom I have not had the opportunity to communicate directly yet, please know that those consultations are going on. that we are determined to do whatever we can to see that that particular property stops being a problem to the greatest degree of our powers under the law. Having noted that, it's time to move to the general agenda. Item G1, please.
Item G1, presentation of annual report on 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness.
And reporting here, we have two folks. If you'll introduce yourself to those in the community that haven't had a chance to hear you before.
I'm Andrea Kurtz. I'm the Senior Director of Housing Strategies at United Way, and
Thank
I've helped lead this community's implementation of the 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness.
Well, thank you for coming out this evening. This is an important issue to our community. We want to do what we can to address this issue, and you're going to tell us what's being done now, please.
Yes. Thank you, members of the City Council. I'm very happy to be here today to give our annual report on the progress of the 10-year plan. As you can see, the title of my presentation today is The Long Road Home, Creating a Common Vision and Collective Action to End Homelessness in Our Community. And I'd like to just start my presentation by saying, you know, when I took this job about 7 years ago now, people really questioned a lot, can we end homelessness in our community? And I'm very happy to be here today to tell you that I think I've convinced everybody that we can. The vision of the plan was that with the full support of our community and the homeless service providers, that we will provide effective solutions and accessible services to eliminate chronic homelessness and to improve the system's effectiveness for all persons experiencing a housing crisis. And I'm very excited that we really are making some inroads into this, as you'll see the data shows us. Just a little bit of background to sort of mark where our progress was. In 2005, the city put together the Blue Ribbon Task Force on Homelessness, which created the 10-year plan. And in 2006, the city and the county jointly created the 10-year plan commission on homelessness. In 2006, Experiment in Self-Reliance, also known as ESR, implemented our first Housing First project called the 5th Street Project. It's an 8-unit permanent supported housing project for chronically homeless people on 5th Street.
And would you tell folks listening what what Housing First means?
Yes. So Housing First is a philosophy in which when people become homeless, the service interventions, the first intervention we look at is housing. We don't look at any of the other service needs that the family has until they have been rehoused, putting housing as the primary focus for serving people who are homeless.
So this is in contrast to the older approach in which you assumed that they would stay in an emergency shelter kind of situation while other issues were addressed first.
Correct. So what had been happening in our system is that people who lost their housing would come into emergency shelter or into a transitional program, and we try and help them solve their family's problems before we got them back into housing. What research really shows is that for people and families who are homeless, getting them into housing makes all the other interventions not only more cost effective, but more effective overall. In 2006, the United Way was asked to help take a lead role in implementing this plan. In 2007, we had our first project, Homeless Connect, and I put this on the list of significant projects in our background because that was a major event for the 10-year plan. It was the first thing we had done, and it brought all of the community service providers together. And for the first time, not only were we able to provide services to people who are homeless under one roof on that day, but many of the service providers, and I'm not just talking about homeless service providers, but mainstream providers like DSS, Social Security, the Veterans Administration, mental health providers, landlords, all got together under one roof, and they found that by working together as a system, they could transform how they did their individual services, and they could be better service providers at doing what they did by working collaboratively. And that, I think, really changed the dynamic of how all of our services in the community worked together to solve the issue of homelessness. In 2007, we also started the SSI Outreach Access and Recovery Program. This is also known as the SOAR program. This program is really designed to help particularly chronically homeless people, people who have disabilities and have been homeless for very long periods of time, access disability income. And that really is the foundation for how case managers are moving people with long-term chronic homelessness and disabilities from homelessness into housing, because it gives that individual their own source of income from which they can then access housing. In 2009, we started the HPRP program, which is the first iteration in our community of a program called Rapid Rehousing. And while this was not something on our radar when we wrote the plan in 2005, it really has become sort of a staple of how we have transformed our system. And what Rapid Rehousing does is it works with people as they become homeless and trying to get them as quickly as we can into housing. And at the time that we started the 10-year plan, we had really two options for helping people who were having financial difficulties getting into housing. One was nothing. The other option was long-term housing subsidies like Section 8 or Shelter Plus Care certificates. And there was no middle ground. Rapid Rehousing really is that middle ground. So we can work with people anywhere from 3 to 6 months up to 24 months with a subsidy and case management services that help them transition out of homelessness into permanent housing. And so that, you'll see later in this presentation, that program has been having tremendous results and is, I think, responsible for a lot of the progress we've seen in our community. In 2010, the 10-year plan had its first from the ground up build, and that was Hunter's Hill, which is a 12-unit supported housing project in the West-Salem neighborhood for people with disabilities. And what was really remarkable about this project is we had had a lot of, as I'm sure you are all aware of, NIMBY issues where people didn't want projects for homeless people in their neighborhood because they thought that it would transform their neighborhood in a bad way. And what we were really excited about with Hunter's Hill is that by the time we broke ground, the neighbors had really come to see that we were going to be an asset to their neighborhood. And I'm very proud to say that to this day, the neighborhood associations see this project as an asset to the West-Salem neighborhood and to the residents who live there. In 2011, we started looking at how do we develop programs specifically for homeless veterans. At the time of our plan, and even through 2011, veterans were about 20% of our homeless population in our county, while they're only 11% of the U.S. total population. So they're almost double the number of veterans in our community who are homeless than there should be just based on their proportion in the population. So we really put a very specific focus on that. And then in 2012, we started operating under the Hearth Act funding and looking at how are we going to reallocate resources in our community to better serve people who are homeless. Part of the 10-year plan, as you may be aware, is the creation of 598 supported housing units, and I'm very excited to tell you that to date we are at 81% of that goal. And we hope that by the end of this year we will actually complete that goal. This is what affordable housing looks like. This is a picture of Hunter's Hill. And we, as the 10-year plan, we are very committed that any affordable housing that we build is an asset to the neighborhood and that it is a project where any one of us would be happy to live in it. One of the first things we did as the 10-year plan is work with the community's homeless council to understand what our current system looks like. And this is a picture of that current system. And what you can see under the bottom of that, maybe not on the big screen, but in your notebooks, there's a green bar that says the city of Winston-Salem, and we are very blessed to have the support and leadership of the city in directing homeless services in our community. And the city really administers a number of grants, many of which are pass-throughs from the federal government, but also from the state, that help fund the network of services in our community. You can also see the big yellow box is the Homeless Council, which was started in 1986 after another community task force looking at the issues of homelessness. And that task force is made up of many representatives from our community, including all of the homeless service providers, as well as emergency assistance providers, community action agencies, the faith community, mental health and substance abuse providers, legal services. Consumers also participate actively in this group, trying to look at the whole continuum of services, from emergency shelters all the way into permanent supported housing projects, on how are we serving people in our community who are homeless, and how are we able to make those services better. So the 10-year Plan Commission, when it was created in 2006 and started its work in 2007, really tried to find its way in this matrix of services, and you can see it sort of there squarely in the middle. And a lot of what the 10-year plan has been doing since it came in is helping make decisions about where are we investing resources in this system, how are we shifting resources in the system to focus on the goal of ending homelessness. I love this slide. I went to Costa Rica one year and we took this boat ride across this lake. And on the other side, we got picked up by people who didn't speak English, and no one in our boat spoke Spanish, but they're like, we got to help people. We got that communicated, and we came to this car that was stuck in the mud, and they had one truck attached to it pulling to the right, and another truck pulling off to the left, and they were trying to get this car stuck out of the mud. And we're trying to explain in English that as long as you have two cars pulling in different directions, this car was never getting out of the mud. That everybody had to be moving in the same direction. And that really is a lot of the work that we were doing with the homeless providers. Because at the time that the 10-year plan came in, we had a tremendous number of really great, wonderful agencies and programs in the community helping homeless people. And each of them were doing their own thing, and each of them had their own goals and visions for what it meant to do their work. And a lot of what the 10-year plan has done is come in and said, we have one goal, and that is ending homelessness. And wherever you fit in that goal is great. But everybody in the system is focused on ending homelessness. And to do that, we really had to understand who was playing what role. And a lot of our providers haven't changed tremendously what they're doing, except that they have started focusing not just on their own mission, but also on the goal of ending homelessness. And understanding how they fit in that role. So moving all of the providers in our community to focus in the same direction, and that's ending homelessness. And that's really important, because the goal isn't to provide emergency shelter. The goal isn't to cure substance abuse or mental health problems. The goal isn't to end poverty. The goal is to end homelessness. So this is our point-in-time count chart. So what you can see, one of the things you have to understand about this data is our data set is about 500 people per night. And because of that, when you run percentages on it, for the most part, a small change in your raw data makes a big change in your percentages because the population set is very small. But when you look at it this way, longitudinally, you can see, for the most part, from 1996, when we started the count, to 2012, we had a relatively flat line. But we were very excited last January when we had what I think are some pretty significant drops down in all of the counts that we were doing. And we had our lowest count on record. There was about a 40% drop in our annual count data. We had a 58% drop in our chronic homeless count, and a 48% drop in our veteran count. And we were very excited about that. We are hoping that this is a real lasting change that you're going to see in our system. And we think that has a lot to do with some of the changes that we have made. We'll find out in a couple months. So also, at the same time that the point-in-time count data came out, Forsyth Futures published their biannual report on the status of homelessness in our community. And they had a number of findings that were pretty exciting for us. The slide that you see right now is looking at exits followed by a return into the homeless service system. So this is our recidivism rate. So what you see, what looks like a really big long bar is coming out of emergency shelters. Who from an emergency shelter goes back into a homeless service program? I will say this, they're under 35% of people who are served by an emergency shelter come into another homeless service program. In that 35, just rounding up to 35%, that includes people who go from an emergency shelter into a transitional housing program, which is sort of how we're set up as a system, or were previously. It includes people who were in emergency shelter, they leave for a while, maybe going out on the street, maybe going to their boyfriend or girlfriend's house, and then coming back to an emergency shelter. And there's a small number of those people who we place in permanent housing and come back. But relatively speaking, about a third of the people who come from an emergency shelter come back to another, or they're people who go from one shelter to another shelter. And that's actually sort of encouraging. I mean, it's a workable number of people who are sort of going from one homeless program to another. Some of them are by design. In transitional housing, we have less than a 20% recidivism rate. And then in our permanent supported housing project, so those people who were investing the most intensive resources in to stay in permanent housing, we have about a 5% return rate. And given the challenges that this population faces, so these are people who have been on the streets for over a year, they're people with long-term chronic disabilities, that we have a 5% return rate out of permanent supportive housing into a homeless program is really pretty remarkable. So we're very encouraged and excited by this data. I want to look, the next slide looks at length of stay data in our emergency shelters. When we saw this data for the first time, we were actually really super excited. The HUD, just so you understand, the HUD goal for homeless programs nationally is that your community's average length of stay for a homeless person in your community is under 30 days. And what this chart showed us is that 50% of the people that we help stay in our emergency shelters for less than 2 weeks. And for the most part, they're not coming back. And we're pretty excited about that. Because that means whatever our emergency shelters are doing right now, 50% of the people are getting very little intervention other than a couple weeks at the emergency shelter, and they're getting back out of homelessness into our community. So the chunk that we're really focusing on right now, it's the 10-year plan, is on the other extreme, are those probably about 5 to 7%, those last two bars of people who are in the system more than 181 days. That's where you're going to see our chronically homeless crew show up. And then those 3 bars in the middle are the people who aren't getting out with nothing, but need something more than permanent supported housing to get them out of the homeless system back into our community and back into permanent housing. So this is our point in time count chart again. We like this chart. It shows, again, the 40% decrease in the total homeless count and the 6% decrease in our chronic homeless count. This is our change, showing how our system has changed in housing placements. So in this data set, the first year, the blue line is 2009, the red line is 2009 to 10, the red line is 10 to 11, and the green line is 11 to 12 data. The data's on a July to June calendar. And as you can see, there's been in all, both with chronically homeless, adult-only households, and households with children, every one of these years, we are getting better and better at moving people from homeless programs into permanent supported housing, or into permanent housing, sorry. Not all, most of it is not permanent supported housing. Most of it is market rate housing that people are going into. One of the most remarkable is the households with children went from 35% to 72% exits from a homeless program into permanent housing. But across the board, even chronically homeless went from a 33% exit to permanent housing into a 46% exit into permanent housing. And a lot of this has to do with changing everybody's focus from managing people during their homeless crisis into getting them into housing. This is our 2012 length of stay data. For emergency shelters, the average length of stay, and this is for all stayers, is 59 days. As I said, the HUD goal is to get that down under 30 days. What's exciting to me about this is, and it's not in this presentation, but when we looked at this data in 2010, we were the average length of stay in our homeless system overall as a community was upwards of 250 days. So just since 2010, we have come way down in our length of stay in this community.
That's mean, not median.
What?
That's mean, not median.
Yes.
Average days.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And then in our so one of the things that we're working on with the service providers right now is looking at what is the appropriate length of stay for people based on their program. So one of the things with transitional housing, we have an average length of stay of 107 days. A lot of the transitional housing programs are designed to serve people anywhere from 18 to 24 months. So a lot of people are coming through these transitional housing programs for very short stays. So we're trying to look at, are we using those resources in the way that they were designed in the best way possible to make sure that we're targeting resources all across the board to the right people. And then you can see in our rapid rehousing, now the rapid rehousing data that is in this presentation is from the HPRP program, which was a 3-year program funded by the stimulus program. We have gotten much better at rapid rehousing since then. And even at this point in time, we had an average length of stay in that program of 90 days. And that was from those people, and most of those households are people whom in the first 2 weeks of working with them, we moved them from the shelter or from the streets into permanent housing. And then we work with them out of permanent housing. So most of those 90 days are people who are actually in permanent housing, not staying in our streets or in the shelters. These are rates of housing placement by service type. So the first bar is emergency shelters. The national consultants who helped us put this data together said that the 42% exit from emergency shelter into permanent housing nationally is our rate is very high compared to the national rates. I don't remember what the national rates were. Some of that has to do with a number of our shelters have case managers working with people in the emergency shelter to get out. Many shelters across the country just provide overnight services and no case management. In transitional housing, you see a 72% rate of exits to permanent housing. And one of the reasons we love rapid rehousing is you see a 92% exit from rapid rehousing into permanent housing. The other thing which is not in this presentation is when you look at the cost data, emergency shelters are fairly cheap relative to these other programs, except when you look at their rate of permanent housing placement, they become very expensive because they have such a low rate of exit to permanent housing relative to the other programs. Transitional housing is the most expensive form of intervention because you bring people to you, you provide for them for some length of time, their housing, their food, their utilities, all of that. In rapid rehousing, the average cost of moving someone from homelessness into permanent housing is about $5,500. So that intervention for us becomes the most cost-effective way to move someone from homelessness into permanent housing. A lot of what the 10-year plan is focused on right now is moving towards what works. What we know is that no one intervention is the answer for everyone who becomes homeless in our community. So one of the things we were very committed to is making sure that we have a diversity of services in our community. I often talk about the housing system a lot like the medical system. So in the medical system, you have a large spectrum of services from emergency rooms to primary care physicians. And in between, you have a lot of different specialists. And we have the same kind of diversity of services for housing. We need emergency shelters for when people have a housing emergency, and there could be any reason that that happens. We want people to have permanent housing, just like we want them to have primary care physicians. But sometimes people need something different than that, and that's where transitional housing may come in. And so a lot of the work we're doing right now with providers is how do we target these resources? Because some of them, like rapid rehousing, are fairly inexpensive. Some of them, like emergency shelter or permanent supported housing, can be kind of expensive. So we want to make sure that we use those resources for the people who need them. And a lot of that work is coming through coordinated intake. And last year when I presented, we were presenting the business plan for what that was going to look like. And we're at this point actually starting to implement that model so that in order to get access into the supported housing programs like Shelter Plus Care, like some of the permanent supported housing projects, like rapid rehousing, people come through a coordinated assessment team. And that team makes the decision based on the factors that this household is facing, which of the programs they're going to go into. This is just a look at the addition of supported housing programs between permanent supportive and transitional housing projects that we put together to get us to 81% of our goal. This housing project that you see here is the Fifth Street Extension project that was opened last year in partnership between the city and ESR.
Andrea, you've been using the term a lot. For those who are not familiar with it,
Yep.
what's the shorthand difference between transitional housing and permanent supported housing?
Okay. So in transitional housing, it is a short-term, it's a medium-term intervention program. It's typically clients will come and stay in a facility for anywhere between 18 and 24 months to receive services and other kinds of interventions that will then help them when they move out of that facility into a permanent house that's theirs. Whereas permanent supported housing is an individual would move into an apartment or a housing unit where they have the lease in their name, and no matter what happens to their services, they get to stay in that house. And the services will come to them, work with them as long as they need it, and then they'll pull away if that's what's needed, or they'll stay if they're needed, or they'll hook up different services. But the housing unit remains with the individual who's living there.
Thank you.
So where do we go from here? one of the things we're really working on is how do we, as a system of service providers, make data-driven decisions. All of the work that we do is human service oriented. It is driven by compassion and justice for the people we serve. But we also need to look not just at the individual case needs, but as our system as a whole. And how does our system make data-driven decisions? We're also working with, on the issues of system governance. So how do we make good decisions as collaborators? When I came to work with the homeless service system, we had some really strong, good partners of homeless service providers that were already working together in a really well-coordinated network. But at the time, each one did their own thing independently. But as we moved to a system where we have coordinated assessment, where we're really trying to work to make sure that no matter what door of the system someone who's homeless enters, they have access to the full array of services in our community. How do we do that together? And how do we govern this collaborative? And so really moving from coordination into a collaborative model of service delivery. And then the last piece is how do we move people into rapid rehousing, which really is the iteration of housing first. So how do we move people, when they become homeless, into housing and support them in that housing in a more community-based model.
And one other thing, rapid rehousing in this context is, well, it's self-explanatory in part, but it's also a term of art. It means moving them into permanent housing, not transitional housing or shelter.
Correct. Okay. So it is, rapid rehousing it's a style of case management and temporary financial assistance that provides short to medium term financial assistance paired with case management, focused on getting people into permanent housing, providing them some temporary financial support, but then really connecting them to the resources they need to be self-sufficient. What does this all mean? So we had these national experts come in and look at our community data. And what they told us about our system is that, well, HARTH, the federal government, has this goal that no one would, defining ending homelessness as meaning no one in your community is homeless for more than 30 days. And what they said to us is we're the first community they've looked at where they really think, based on the decisions of reallocation that we made last year, and based on the rate of work that our community providers are currently doing, that we can end homelessness in Winston-Salem. So we're super excited about that. I'll say it again. They really believe we can end homelessness in Winston-Salem. Understanding that what we have done in our system through the reallocations, and you'll see that in the next presentation on the COC grants, is created a system where we emphasize resources in housing placement. We continue to maintain a diversity of services from emergency services through permanent supported housing, and that we've created a system where we can have more outputs into permanent housing than people coming into our homeless service system. I say that barring any unforeseen economic crisis or housing crises that we didn't predict. And I end on this slide, which is a picture of the basket that was brought to residents when they moved into Hunters Hill. As I said, Hunters Hill was the first project we did in a neighborhood. And by the time we did our ribbon cutting, the neighborhood associations did an old-fashioned pounding and brought the residents at Hunters Hill gardening baskets for their community garden, which is what you see here, and then supplies for their individual houses, a pound of sugar, a pound of flour, a pound of butter, which is part of the old-fashioned pounding, which was a really wonderful way to welcome them to their new homes. So any other questions?
Well, thank you very much. I know it's been a pleasure to work with you and the commission for several years, and I want to thank Councilmember Light for stepping in to be our next representative from the City Council to the Homelessness Commission. And I know that the meetings of that group welcome other elected officials as well. So whenever Councilmember Taylor or Adams or others of our colleagues have the opportunity to sit in, I know that it's an informative process, and it's producing some very good news these days. Thank you. Questions yes, Councilmember Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Kurtz, I just want to thank you for a detailed presentation. It was very informational, and what I'm doing right now is trying to figure out how I want to frame my question. But I'll start off by saying, in my earlier days, I worked at a community corrections program which was housed in a local community or emergency shelter. And I got a chance to see how that concept kind of works from the inside out. I noticed that there were single shelters for men, single shelters for women, then there were family shelters for women with families. But I didn't see, I saw some men come through with families, and I saw that our structure was not able to kind of work with those particular populations. So I guess my question is, how are we tracking the issue of homelessness with male-headed households with families? And what are we doing to address those problems? Because given the situation with the economy, I'm sure we're seeing a lot more of that currently. So how are we working with it here in our community?
We definitely see it. We definitely see it in our community. I got a call about a gentleman and his 2 children who are homeless today. One of the things we were very fortunate in our community is that Salvation Army, which is our family shelter, takes both men and women. They take intact families, they take male-headed single-headed households, and they take female-headed households. The one challenge Salvation Army has right now is their space allocations and the way their rooms are configured. And so while they will take male-headed households, intact families, a lot of it depends on who's in the shelter at any given moment. Salvation Army is very committed that if they can't take a family into their shelter, that they will either help them locate other housing or they'll put them up in a hotel. So if families are contacting Salvation Army, they will do everything in their power to make sure that that family is not out on the street, with the understanding that sometimes there's room rearranging. The other challenge that they have is about all of their beds are bunked, so about half their beds are up beds, and they can't put children in the up beds, and they can't put anybody who's disabled in the up beds. So sometimes they have empty beds only because they can't use their up beds. So one of the things I'm working with them on is looking at their facility issues.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that. That was actually the shelter that I did work at. And I noticed that at certain times of the year, there would be single females on one side, single families with women on the other, and then there would be no place for the men to go. So I'm just curious if there was some kind of infrastructure put in place. But what I'm hearing is that, sometimes men, head of household families are put in hotels, and other arrangements are made. So if anybody is in a situation, they can contact the Salvation Army or the United Way and maybe get some assistance along that vein. Okay, thank you.
And following up on that, my understanding of the new coordination process is that someone who is in a homelessness situation can contact any of the providers, and they will see to it that they get sent in short order through to the right agency to help them. So it's not.
That's really part of our goal, is to make sure that wherever somebody is who's homeless and whoever they contact, that they will get to the places where they need to get services aimed at getting them housed.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Thank you very much. That's an informative and encouraging presentation, and we look forward to continuing to work with you and your entire team.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate your support.
Congratulations on your good work. Then let's move to the item G2.
Item G2, resolution authorizing submission of continuum of care homeless grant application, acceptance of grant funds, and execution of agreements.
Very good, thank you. And presenting here?
I will.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this item actually just dovetails into the item that you just heard the presentation from Ms. Kurtz. In reference to this, actually provides the funding for those initiatives that you've heard about. It provides funding to the various continuum of care agencies through both the Homeless Council as well as the 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness. The city serves as the pass-through for these funds, and both those agencies or commissions have in fact reviewed all of the requests that have been submitted and recommended to you for approval. Since 1995, the city has assisted close to 9,000 individuals through these various programs, and about $21.6 million of federal funds through our continuum of care programs. The initiative or the request that you have in front of you today would fund another 24 programs and about a dozen agencies totaling $1.8 million to help continue those efforts to help end homelessness in our community. So staff is here today from Community and Business Development to answer any questions you may have, as well as I'm here.
Questions? Councilor Adams?
Yes, I thought and maybe I mistakenly, I thought I saw in the paper, Chronicle Journal somewhere, where we were saying something about taking applications or for this, or something like that. And I thought I saw a November date or something. What was that about?
Tim, it's a fairly detailed process, but yes, they did actually, the council did solicit requests from the various agencies to go through this process. But I'll let Tim West
Yeah.
with the Community and Business Development.
And I understand that, but I just saw this like a couple of weeks ago, I know, somewhere in the paper. And it had a November 2013 something date in there for people to
Well,
submit
okay.
something, so kind of explain that to me, and I'm looking at these names
yes.
here, because I'm gonna go back and get that paper.
Yeah, I'm Tim West with the Community Business Development Department. I'm not familiar with that one. We did have an RFP process, and it was advertised in the Chronicle and on TV 13 and among homeless council agencies for the grants that you see here. And I don't remember the deadline now. We have had a timeline for the whole process working up to these meetings, but it was earlier.
Okay.
So I'm not
Check
sure what
on
that one is.
Because it drew my attention, because I remembered reading it, and then when I saw this, I'm like, okay, so where does that tie off at? You know, did they run the article and run the date wrong? But I'm almost sure that there was another date in there that was longer, further out than just now. It was like November the something, so I'll check on that, Mr. Chair.
Could also have been either a reference to anticipated date that
The
submission would be
announcements?
made to, the announcement.
Okay.
Possible.
But thank you.
Sure.
Other questions or comments? Yes, Councilmember Taylor.
Mr. Page, are you aware of any agencies that apply for funding or could use some of this particular funding that we're serving as a pass-through for that were not selected to participate?
I'm going to again turn to Tim with the other agencies.
Wes?
Yes, there was one additional project that did apply for funding and was not recommended for funding. It was a project that sought to do a group home type facility for homeless veterans. It was not recommended for funding by the rating panel, mainly because...
Could you help me with that acronym, please? You said the what panel?
Rating panel.
Rating panel.
Yes, sir. There's a panel of representatives from the Homeless Council who review the projects in detail and make a recommendation to the Homeless Council and to the 10-Year Plan Commission. Both of those bodies vote on these recommendations before they come here. And that all the proposals that you see here were reviewed, as well as that additional proposal. And the recommendation was not, that project was not recommended for funding.
Do we know that it was not recommended for funding because it had not been normally on the funding list? Or do we know why this
Yes.
program was not recommended for funding? And what program was it?
Well, it's a program called Ministry for Christ, and they have a house up on Patterson Avenue near the intersection with Glenn, and they proposed serving homeless veterans in that facility. The panel didn't recommend it for funding because the average cost of permanent housing projects that are in this list is about $4,400. Their proposal indicated an proposed average annual cost per person of about $26,000, mainly because it was very staff-heavy. So it was going to be very expensive. I think you've heard Andrea talk quite a bit about rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. Most of those are rental assistance-based. We found it's very efficient to be able to use existing housing in the community with rental assistance and give people the services where they live, where they choose to live in the community. So when we looked at that model versus a group home that was going to cost $26,000 to serve each person during the year for about 5 persons per year, it just was not recommended for funding. The other issue is that, I would say 2 to 3 years ago, we really had a shortage of resources for homeless veterans. But because we have a very successful 10-year plan, as you see, and we've brought in more resources for veterans in the last couple of years, particularly in the supportive services for homeless veterans, for veterans families program, the panel looked at that as well and said, should we spend $26,000 per person per year to get 5 more beds for veterans when we have these other resources that we really are struggling to use in some ways. So that was the second point.
Well, and I was thinking, even if the program was not as popular, as long as it was credible, I would want to touch as many people as possible and make sure we're spreading the wealth around. Because what we find is that the popular companies, the popular organizations receive all the money every single time, and the upstart companies who do just good work, the upstart organizations are not at the trough. And if it's a situation where there were some astronomical numbers, I'm okay with that. You know, did anybody talk to them about adjusting their numbers, or was it just like, let's put a cross over it and move on?
No, they
Sounds to me
actually,
like they want to do some good work, but
we were impressed with their passion and what they wanted to do, and actually I've worked with Reverend Nash in the past. She's done some good work in the community. In this case, they were invited and came down and met with the rating panel and presented their project and answered questions, asked questions, got other answers. And it wasn't just crossed off. We did have an in-depth interview about the project.
okay, thank you, sir. My questions have been satisfied.
Thank you. Councilmember Adams?
Yes, I guess I'm kind of in agreement with Councilmember Taylor that, you know, I have no issue with any of these agencies and what they do. But if we're still expected to grow jobs and opportunity and small business development in this city, we've got to somehow, as a city, how do we plug these people in, just like we do small business development for businesses? There are some non-traditional businesses that have an opportunity to do something. With all of the veterans coming home, and we know there are a lot, and I'd like the number of how many veterans we've helped through this continuing care grant allocations, of how we get them plugged in, because right now, over the lifetime of this, in my life in Winston, I basically have seen every one of these agencies come around or be about. You know, some of them are older than others. But I would like to see some other parts of the community that can benefit, not just from the business, but from the engagement of the community, of seeing that we can help in every community, and not just, again, this footprint where we put it only in certain parts of the city. So I guess going forward, again, the 24 that's on here now, were these the same 24 that were here last year and year over year going back? Basically.
These 24 projects were, there was about half of them are the same same agencies and projects that were here a year ago when a lot of the funds were reallocated. For a number of years, a lot of the projects had been in place, but because of the Hearth Act, and as Andrea has indicated, we tried to move money over to a rapid rehousing and coordinated intake approach. So last year, we brought these projects to you, and you approved the reallocation, basically as you see here, and this is a renewal of something that was big changes a year ago.
I remember the Hearth. And there's some other things coming down the pike, is that not true? Basically,
Yes, because of Hearth.
right.
Yes.
I just want to make one final comment. I'm thinking about, for example, I hate to call out agencies, but just at the front of my mind, I'm thinking about Harry Veterans Group. And in my opinion, humbly, I think they probably do more work with veterans than anybody in this city. But I don't see them here on this list. Maybe there's a perfectly good reason why they're not on the list, but I would just ask next year, when the funding allocation comes around, let's reach out to these other organizations and make sure they have a seat at the table. If they don't want it, fine. If they don't have the type of infrastructure in order to handle these types of programs and monies, fine. But let's make sure we're reaching out to everyone. And I'm not saying we've done a bad job, but I just want to make sure everybody has a seat at the table, because, you know, the harvest is great, but the laborers are few. And we want to make sure that everybody is getting their fair shake at these types of programs.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Councilmember Light?
I was just going to add to that certainly Harry does wonderful work with the veterans, mainly, though, as an advocate for the services that the government owes them and they have not been getting. So I think this is different in the fact that it has to do with housing and homelessness. So there may be a little bit of difference there.
There are no other questions or comments. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved.
All right, moved and seconded to approve. If there's no other discussion, those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. That is approved. Thank you very much.
Thank y'all.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
your
Thanks, Andrea.
thorough briefing. Dr. Park, you didn't have a chance to speak, but thank you for coming this evening. And that concludes the items on this evening's agenda. We stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.